you're looking at the RB2 by fantasy points per game. If he maintains his typical efficiency, you're looking at 28.4 fantasy points per game. Those are numbers only Marshall Faulk, Priest Holmes, LaDainian Tomlinson, Christian McCaffrey have ever reached. So clear league winner. We talked about this all season, and now it's here. I think the odds are really good. He's going to finish as one of the most valuable players in fantasy just because of this David Montgomery injury.
Yeah, the David Montgomery injury is massive. And anybody who's sort of like, Scott, he was already going to be good. Here's a couple of stats for you. Every single game that David Montgomery has missed, Jahmyr Gibbs has scored a touchdown. And the fewest rushing yards he had in any of those games was 99. Every single weekly finish that David Montgomery, in games that David Montgomery missed, Gibbs has finished as a top 5 running back, top 4 running back, actually. And I have a kind of a bold take to add on to this one. Scott's going to give you a bunch of data. I'm going to give you a bunch of vibes. Jahmyr Gibbs will, after these next 2 weeks, after he wins titles, is going to be like the contrarian pick at the 101 heading into 2025.
What?
Why are you shaking your head? You're welcome.
Week 16 fantasy football playoffs are here. 2 more weeks in every single league before you know who the champion is, before we know who wins the trophy, and before we know who wins all that money. This is the School of Scott. I'm Theo Gremminger. Scott Barrett and I are bringing you episodes like this every single week. But all of our information on this show comes from Fantasy Points and Fantasy Points data. And if you're looking for a great last-minute holiday gift, look no further. You can either gift this to the fantasy football fan in your life or to yourself, which is a pretty good way about going about things. And the early bird special at Fantasy Points, you get 20% off. You get all of 2024 for free and all of next season. You're going to get access to all of the 2025 rookie class information, NFL Combine reactions, Senior Bowl reactions, NFL free agency, everything that will affect fantasy football in the offseason. You'll have access to that. Get ahead of your league mates with the early bird special. And Scott, question for you. Does our code SCHOOL25 still work in addition to this? We have a 25% off code that you might be able to add onto the early bird special just for our listeners.
Yeah, it's not supposed to be active, but I think it's active right now. So act fast. I'll probably remember to turn that off at the end of the week. So right now active.
Yeah, this is going to be the cheapest that Fantasy Points is going to be all season long. You get tremendous value, and you get access to Scott's Everything Report. You're going to have access to my Dynasty article, the best rankings in the business, and you have an opportunity to use this same price to the same 20% off early bird special to get Fantasy Points data, the best source of data information available to you anywhere in fantasy football. So last minute gift, go ahead and get it and use the code SCHOOL25 for now. Scott, let's start it out. We're talking about a perfect storm of opportunity. One of the most exciting players in fantasy was in a shared backfield situation and still thriving. David Montgomery is now done for the year. Everybody's saying for the year. David Montgomery's saying, I'm maybe going to not get surgery. Maybe I'll be there for the Super Bowl or something. But essentially, he's done. Jahmyr Gibbs last week went nuts, 28 PPR points. Now he has the backfield all to himself. And when you add into it all of the defensive injuries in Detroit, every Lions game is shaping up to be a shootout. And Jahmyr Gibbs is going to lead fantasy managers to
a championship. Obviously, this is something we've been talking about every single week in the Everything Report. The massive upside should this backfield move away from a perfectly evenly split 50-50 backfield by XFP expected fantasy. But it was so frustrating. It's Jahmyr Gibbs, far and away the most efficient runner in football, leads all running backs in EPA per carry, by yards per carry, explosive run rate, missed tackles forced, top 5 in all those stats. David Montgomery closer to average. But again, perfectly evenly split. 50% of the backfield by XFP to Gibbs, 50% to Montgomery in what has been far and away the most valuable backfield in fantasy by raw fantasy points, by XFP. And so now you get a guy who's not just going to get 60% instead of 50% or 70%. There's a chance he gets all of it. Craig Reynolds, Sion Bucky, like they're going to mix in a little bit. But if we say he gets just a 73% share of the backfield, let's say he's perfectly average in efficiency, you're looking at the RB2 by fantasy points per game. If he maintains his typical efficiency, you're looking at 28.4 fantasy points per game. Those are numbers only Marshall Faulk, Priest Holmes, LaDainian Tomlinson, Christian McCaffrey have ever reached. So clear league winner. We've talked about this all season, and now it's here. So shout out to everyone who drafted Jahmyr Gibbs, has Jahmyr Gibbs in Best Ball Mania. I think the odds are really good. He's going to finish as one of the most valuable players in fantasy just because of this David Montgomery injury.
Yeah, the David Montgomery injury is massive. And anybody who's sort of like, Scott, he was already going to be good. Here's a couple of stats for you. Every single game that David Montgomery has missed, Jahmyr Gibbs has scored a touchdown. And the fewest rushing yards he had in any of those games was 99. Every single weekly finish that David Montgomery, in games that David Montgomery missed, Gibbs has finished as a top 5 running back, top 4 running back, actually. It was RB3, RB1, RB1, RB4, RB3. And I have a kind of a bold take to add on to this one. Scott's going to give you a bunch of data. I'm going to give you a bunch of vibes. Jahmyr Gibbs will, after these next 2 weeks, after he wins titles, is going to be like the contrarian pick at the 101 heading into 2025. Jamar Chase is the chalk. Saquon Barkley is the chalk number 2 overall pick. But Jahmyr Gibbs is about to average 30 points per game in the money weeks. People have recency bias. They're going to remember that Jahmyr Gibbs led people to championships. You're going to have David Montgomery coming off of a knee injury, and he's getting older. People are going to talk themselves into Jahmyr Gibbs, and once you see what a ceiling outcome for Jahmyr Gibbs is in terms of usage, people are going to keep buying into that. Jahmyr Gibbs will end up being the chalk number 3 overall pick, and he will be the contrarian 101 for high volume drafters, for people looking to get a little bit of an edge and looking to be a little bit different. And then you're going to get the people saying wide receiver 1s never repeat as wide receiver 1s. So Jahmyr Gibbs, remember that you heard it first on School of Scott. Dark Horse 101. You'll start hearing it a lot in January.
I don't think that happens.
It's happening.
Don't forget, Montgomery just signed a fat contract a few weeks ago. But this is we're going to do a show in, I don't know, maybe 3 weeks or so, maybe more. We're going to go toe-to-toe battling over, I'm going to give you my way too early 2025 ranks. You're going to give yours. You're going to have Gibbs much higher than me. I'm excited for that.
Yeah, that's going to be awesome. And Jahmyr Gibbs is not the only beneficiary to the defensive complete breakdown in Detroit. Jared Goff also playing at an extremely high level. What should fantasy managers expect for Jared Goff these next 2 weeks? You got Chicago this week, and then you have San Francisco in week 17. And Scott, you bring up Best Ball Mania. This Detroit-San Francisco game was circled by so many best ball drafters this past summer. Not necessarily the guys that we thought at the time would pop off, but Jared Goff might be the one.
Yeah, so this is another situation we've been monitoring all season. Goff's been great. He ranks top 7 in fantasy points per dropback. It's just that the volume hasn't been there. In victories, Detroit averages 27.2 pass attempts per game. That's like 43% less than the Browns. Only the Eagles would rank below that. But in Detroit's 2 losses, Goff is averaging 57 pass attempts per game. He just had nearly 500 passing yards in a bottom 6 on paper matchup against the Bills. What really mattered there, not the matchup. It was a pass heavy environment due to game script. And when you're looking at a power law offense, such a potent, deadly offense like Detroit, I think that matters significantly more than the matchup. It's important because he gets back-to-back bottom 6 matchups these next 2 weeks to round out the fantasy playoffs. But I think these are games where game script's going to be good. More importantly, Detroit is now without their workhorse running back, and their defense has been utterly destroyed by injuries. So bad. And so I think all this forces Detroit to lean more pass heavy. I think that's great news for Jahmyr Gibbs, who we just discussed is an obvious league winner. I think that's great news for Jared Goff owners. Is he a mid-range QB1 for me this week? I think he is. I think it's great news for Amon-Ra St. Brown. In games, Detroit has posted a positive pass rate over expectation. He's averaging 13.5 targets, 133.8 yards, 28 fantasy points per game. That's like 2.5 times as many yards as he averages in all other games. So this is another thing to be on the lookout for. This could swing championships. I'm expecting all Detroit pass catchers and the quarterback to get a significant boost over these next few weeks.
Yeah, and a non-show sheet question, but just your opinion. Detroit's been so banged up on the defensive side of the ball. Losing Montgomery as well for like real life football also hurts them. How far is this team going to go? Is this a team that could like go out in their very first playoff matchup, or do you still think Detroit's going to get it together and make a run in the NFC?
I might have the Eagles above them now, just due to the defense, but I think it's really close. You dig into the analytics, it says elite offenses are typically more important, more predictive than elite defenses. I know people generally think defenses win championships. They're more important in playoff time, but this is just such a good offense that, Buffalo didn't slow them down at all. I know they lost that game, but yeah, I'd bet on them going deep into the playoffs.
Yeah, I think I'm with you, but I think I feel a little bit more strongly about Philadelphia like being a clear favorite over them at this point. A couple other teams could be getting it together too, like Minnesota, Green Bay. With Detroit, their defense moving in this direction, I get very nervous that their season could come to a like bitter and sad ending, which is really unfortunate because we wanted to see this Ben Johnson offense in the Super Bowl. That would have been amazing for us as fantasy managers, but hey, man, things happen in the NFL. Scott, we got to talk about Devonta Adams and Aaron Rodgers. The connection that we saw for so many years in Green Bay shined last week. Devonta Adams was awesome. Aaron Rodgers ends up having arguably his best game as a New York Jet. And this week, there could be a shootout type environment against the LA Rams in MetLife Stadium. Your thoughts on Devonta Adams, how he's shaping up to affect leagues? Is this a player who could be a dark horse wide receiver 1 for the rest of the season?
Yeah, I don't know if this is a hot take or not, but I think he's going to win you your championship. If you have him, I think he's an easy mid-range wide receiver 1 this week. I feel really good about it. Since week 9, he leads all players in target share. That was true even prior to last week's season high 40% target share. He's trending in the right direction. 17.6, then 28.9, then 45.8 DraftKings fantasy points the last 3 weeks. 198 yards. That was the second most of his career. He's playing at a really high level. Since week 9, he ranks top 15 in AS. Through the first 8 weeks of the season, he ranks second worst. So really you see this performance tick up. Maybe it's him adjusting to this new offense and really hitting his stride. But here's where the narrative gets a little, conspiratorial maybe. This is pure conjecture, but Garrett Wilson, I think, might be in the doghouse. You saw his sideline tirade in the third quarter of last week's game. Theo, is Aaron Rodgers someone who holds grudges with wide receivers? Is that
That's a thing. That's absolutely a thing. Yeah.
That's a thing. Thank you. And so after that tirade, Adams had a 43% target share to Garrett Wilson's 9.5%. He gained 186 yards with 2 touchdowns and a 2-point conversion. Garrett Wilson only had 2.5 fantasy points after that point. And so on top of all this, Rodgers is looking for a new team. Devonta Adams has $0 guaranteed on his contract. So Jets have nothing to play for, but they both might be auditioning for new teams, new contracts. So I could really easily see Rodgers trying to help his BFF, who moved his family across the country for him, to try and get his BFF a fat contract over these last few weeks. I think he's going to ball out. I think he's going to go crazy. What do you think about that?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think Devonta Adams is a top 5 wide receiver the rest of the way, and sort of this is sort of an overarching theme of this show. You talked about Amon-Ra St. Brown. We talked about now Devonta Adams. Certainly, the Ja'Marr Chase teams are feeling extremely dangerous heading into their matchups, but this is sort of a revenge of the zero RB managers. League winners are not league winners until they win leagues. So, like the whole narrative that these older running backs were going to shape the season, what's happening? Last week, we saw poor performances by Saquon and poor performances by Derrick Henry. Scott's talking about Devonta Adams winning leagues. This is a funny thing how the narrative shifts when we get deeper and deeper into the season. And I'll tell you what, like Devonta Adams, a layup, but I'm going to use Aaron Rodgers in 1 or 2 spots this week. Maybe you were streaming a Jameis Winston. Maybe you're not excited about a guy in the matchup. I think like chasing this particular game with Rodgers at home, coming off of a 3 touchdown pass performance, I think is viable. I'm going to be a little bit higher on Rodgers. I think he's more of like a low end QB1 than he is a high end QB2 this week, but I think he'll have another strong one. And the week before, he had 300 passing yards plus. So I'm on that one. Let's talk a little bit about Baker Mayfield, because if we take a step back and we talk about the most impressive seasonal performance among quarterbacks, we talk about the best ADP values among quarterbacks. We talk about a guy who maybe changed our entire mindset about him as a player. Baker Mayfield should be on that short list. We're talking about a guy with 32 touchdown passes. He's quarterback 5 now. He hasn't gone away. It's a guy who early in the year was like the QB2, and we're like, he'll probably end up being a low-end QB1. But now he's looking like he's going to finish as a top 5 quarterback. He gets Dallas and he gets Carolina the next 2 weeks. This past week, they completely shredded the Chargers. Mayfield had 4 passing touchdowns. He's had so many games this year with multiple passing touchdowns. And Scott, I think the most impressive thing for me is he was missing Mike Evans for such a long portion of the year. Chris Godwin went down with a season-ending injury, and the main consistency in that offense has been Mayfield. Your thoughts on his impressive play this season?
Yeah, he's been awesome, and shout out to our the Fantasy Points data charting staff. They do a weekly article, notes from the charters, right? And since I think it was week 3 or week 4, one of them wrote up Baker Mayfield as just like, this is a completely different player in this offense. And Liam Cohen deserves credit. They ranked top 6 in EPA per play. But Baker deserves a ton of credit as well, because he looks like a completely different player. He's so much more confident. He's ripping the ball out. Velocity is great. Accuracy is great. And he said all this, and he said, I'd bet on this continuing. And it was like weird. It's like confidence. Like, I don't know, how important is that? But every like high level film expert I talk to says that is really one of the most important things for a quarterback. And so it's not just confidence, like personally, like who is the most got that dog in him player in the NFL? I think it's Baker Mayfield. You've seen him just like willing his way to victory or near victories, like against the Chiefs, staying in these games, taking big hits. So he's just like awesome to watch. Like he's one of my favorite quarterbacks to watch this year. But yeah, from a fantasy perspective, no doubt, top 5, leads all quarterbacks in games with at least 27 DraftKings fantasy points, tied with or behind only Lamar in games with at least 18. So from a DFS perspective, massive ceiling, massive floor. And what's crazy is, to your point, yeah, Chris Godwin's missed 7 of 14 games. Mike Evans has cleared a 50% snap share in only 9 of 14. And yeah, he's still playing. Like, what if they find a way to retain a Chris Godwin, a Mike Evans, and a McMillan takes a jump, right? What could this offense look like next year? Or perhaps Liam Cohen comes back to my Giants and is a head coach next year. I could see that happening as well.
So much to unpack with that. I mean, Liam Cohen, I can't wait for when we do lessons learned. I think one of the most enjoyable articles you write all year, Scott, is when you look at offensive coordinators and systems. I think looking at kind of a bird's eye view of them when we look at it recent to the season, Liam Cohen's a guy that, again, we're going to be super, super impressed with. And I agree with you. I think he's going to get at least a number of head coaching interviews. But I think with Mayfield, it's another big lesson learned for me. Like, this guy finished as a QB1 last season, and I think we were a little bit too punitive collectively about the impact Dave Canales' loss was going to have on this offense. In fact, it's been a more exciting offense this year with Cohen. So completely with you. Mayfield, great. Cohen, great. Let's talk about Mike Evans, though. Mike Evans is creeping up on history. If Mike Evans finishes with 1,000 receiving yards, he will be number 2 all time behind Jerry Rice. He's also already in like rarefied air, tied with like Tim Brown for the record now, but he'd be on his own at number 2. Does he get there, Scott?
Oh yeah, I think he does. It's Baker playing at a really high level, but Mike Evans playing at the highest level. He leads all wide receivers in ass. He ranked top 3 last year. He's doing this despite playing multiple games through injury. And the team acknowledged they would love to see Evans reach that feat. He only needs to average 84 yards per game to match the Jerry Rice record. I think he gets there.
Yeah, and if you want access to all the ass you can handle, average separation score at Fantasy Points Data, use the early bird special and sign up for it right now. You'll have it all year long. Your draft prep will never get easier. And use the code SCHOOL25 for now. On top of it, get a little something else off the top. Let's talk about these Baltimore Ravens, because your Giants, Lamar Jackson, completely shredded last week. And, I said this to somebody else on another show this week, Scott. It's funny, because usually when you see these games where Lamar has a great deal of passing success, at least early on, Lamar might have like 2 or 3 touchdown passes, maybe one's a deep one, and the Ravens are rolling. They'll completely take the air out of the football and just lean into the run game for like an entire quarter and a half. This was different. The Ravens continued to pass even when up. Lamar Jackson finishes with an incredible scoring line once again. I know that Josh Allen is the MVP, but for this thing of ours, Lamar Jackson has been the ADP MVP at the quarterback position, just continuing to shine. Your thoughts on Lamar Jackson and this Ravens offense heading into a difficult game against Pittsburgh? Could we see a pass-happy Baltimore Ravens once again?
Yeah, well, it was weird. It was a 35-14 beatdown, and the Ravens never stopped passing. And something you see when you dig into Lamar's numbers this year is like he's really beat up on the bad teams. Bottom 3 defenses, teams like Tampa Bay, the Giants, the Bengals. He's had 4 games against those opponents, and he has 18 touchdowns, 0 interceptions in those 4 games. Across his other 10 games, 16 touchdowns. And this is something you also saw last year. It was a meaningless Week 17 game against the Dolphins. The game was over at halftime, but Lamar just kept piling on the points, 300 plus yards, 5 touchdowns. And yeah, again, this is pure conjecture. It's maybe a little conspiratorial, but I wonder if like Harbaugh is kind of encouraging him to, try to keep pace with Josh Allen for MVP, because that's kind of what he said after that Dolphins game last year is, like we were thinking of that, the MVP race, and we hope that Lamar, put his final stamp on it with this game. And so I wouldn't be surprised. The Steelers are certainly a much tougher matchup than a Dexter Lawrence-less Giants team. But I wouldn't be totally shocked if we see him, have another 4 touchdown game either this week or against the Texans, a much softer matchup in the championship week. Because this is another one of those offenses that is just like really good. It's like, sure, like Derrick Henry could have had 220 rushing yards last week, but they decided to go with a Lamar Jackson 5 touchdown game. And I think that's something they could probably do against Houston as well.
Yeah, it's funny, Todd Monken, as the season progressed last year, he leaned into the pass more and more. And you had that AFC Championship game where he was sort of the scapegoat, where they only ran for like 80 yards. This is one to keep an eye on. And Scott, let's also talk about another Baltimore Raven, Zay Flowers. I can remember back in week 9, we did a School of Scott right after that Denver game. So it was the Denver-Baltimore game where Zay Flowers had his exclamation point week, where he scored 29 PPR points, 2 touchdowns, had one of the nastiest cutbacks from the sideline to the middle, took it to the house, and we were all just going nuts about Zay Flowers and his rest of the season outlook. That was his 4th game out of 5 with like 20 points or more. And ever since then, it's been a lot of quiet weeks for Flowers. He had an 11-point PPR week against the Giants in a game that the passing game was rolling. And in his previous 4 games, he never scored 12 points in any of them. What is your comfort level with using Zay Flowers? Should he be on the bench in week 16 against Pittsburgh and at Houston in week 17? Do you see a bounce back potential? Where are you at on this one?
Yeah. So that's right. He had that 4-game hot streak, or you said 4 of 5 games. He got hurt in one of those games. So, really 4 straight fully healthy games, averaged 22.4. Since then, under 12 fantasy points in each of his last 5. And so obviously this looks rough, but I'm looking at the underlying usage and 26.6% target share over his last 9 games. Easy top 10 numbers at the position, 0 games under an 18%, only 2 games in which he didn't lead the team. So just looking at that underlying usage, I think he's a low end wide receiver too. There's just like frustrating volatility to his profile. I talk about him as a GPP play for DFS every week, where I think him and Ja'Marr Chase lead the position in games with at least 21.5 fantasy points. Flowers' problem is like he's averaged single digits in every other one of his games. So volatile, but like at the end of the day, weighing risk reward, I'd say a low end wide receiver too.
Let's stay in the AFC North. We have the joy of talking about Lamar Jackson, his fantastic season, the joy of talking about a Todd Monken offense. But now we have another very happy situation completely torpedoed. I don't think I've been as angry about a player being benched. Like when you're covering fantasy football all season long, you sort of roll with the punches, but I am extremely emotional. I have a lot of Jerry Jeudy exposure, a lot of David Njoku exposure, some teams with Jameis Winston, and we had circled this Cincinnati-Cleveland game for weeks as a potential shootout. This whole Cleveland Browns coaching staff needs to go. The front office needs to go. I'm furious. How angry are you about our guy, Jameis Winston, getting benched against these Bengals?
I'm livid. This is what we kept talking about. Is like week 16, circle this matchup, Jameis versus the Bengals trash defense. And obviously the Bengals have this super potent, deadly offense, shootout potential. And this is horrible. Yeah. Jeudy ranked behind only Ja'Marr Chase in yards per game since Winston took over. Now he's like a mid-range wide receiver 3 for me. I thought he was like going to automatically carry you to a championship.
He's a wide receiver 1 right now. Jerry Jeudy could have finished as a wide receiver 1. Comeback story there. It's just the whole thing's disgusting. So you're benching, clarify for everybody. So you are benching Jerry Jeudy whenever possible. You're putting him down there in the wide receiver 30-ish range, lower.
Yeah, around there. I mean, I don't know that I'd bench him. It depends on who else he got, but he went from probably like mid-range wide receiver 1 in my rankings, which is not great. To give you some context here, Winston was averaging 321 passing yards per start against non-Steelers opponents. DTR averages 140 passing yards per start in his career. And like a better perspective is like what he brings to the receivers. Winston was averaging 70.7 receiving fantasy points per start. DTR is half that. So it's just rough. Like it hurts everyone. And it hurts the Bengals as well. Like, I mean, I'm sure they're going to crush them. They're going to smash, but like the chances of a shootout diminish massively. And now it's probably more of a Chase Brown game when this could have been like a 50-point Ja'Marr Chase game.
Unbelievably depressing decision. I don't like wishing bad things to happen to people, especially in the holiday season, but I'm ready for this entire Cleveland Browns coaching staff to go. Front office, see you later. Let's get some new blood in there. And this will be an interesting one for us to talk about in the offseason because the last few weeks we looked at Jameis Winston as a potential, at least really fun bridge quarterback, if not a guy who could compete for the Browns starting job. There's no chance it happens. If they're benching him off of that game when they have a AFC North game after his success in AFC North games. They're moving on from Jameis this offseason. That'll be an interesting team to keep an eye on. They should be picking inside the top 10 as well. Gosh, that one really took the wind out of our sails. Let's talk about something happy here.
Okay.
Devonta Smith and A.J. Brown, both heavily targeted in a game. If you're a Devonta Smith manager, you absolutely loved what you saw in Week 15. We've had this sort of beef on the between A.J. Brown and Jalen Hurts. There's been all sorts of rumors with that. You've written about A.J. Brown, about how few routes run he's running relative to other incredibly talented wide receivers. Sort of your thoughts on what you saw last week out of Philly and what we should see in the weeks ahead. A fun matchup this week against Jaden Daniels and the Washington Commanders.
Yeah, this is like what we were saying with the Lions, where it's Eagles ranked dead last in pass attempts per game. And if they were just middle of the pack, there's so much potential and upside for A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith. Last week, they leaned extremely pass heavy in a game they didn't need to. Saquon Barkley got hurt, but he only missed a few drives and came back. And so what did you see? You saw season highs in targets, season highs in fantasy points for both A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith. They combined for 90.5% first read target share. I've never seen that number over, 70% ever. Maybe the last year's Waddle Tyreek Dolphins did that once, but just a crazy number. And so it's, if this continues, this is a ton of upside. Does it? I don't know. It feels like, there was all the drama with A.J. Brown, like the squeaky wheel narrative, him complaining. So like, I don't know if that sticks throughout the rest of the season. That might've just been like a 1 week outlier, to remind folks like what they can do when they actually lean into the pass. But yeah, the stat I had was if A.J. Brown had run as many routes as Ja'Marr Chase this year, he'd have 1,888 receiving yards, like putting him on pace to clear 2K.
Well, shout out to Kellen Moore. Maybe listen to Scott a little bit. Our A.J. Brown shares could have been even better. But it's week 16, Washington, week 17, Dallas. You can just see a scenario where A.J. Brown goes nuts against these NFC East opponents over the next 2 weeks. Even if the volume takes a step back, he's one of the most exciting players at the wide receiver spot. A sort of remind you about what he's all about 3 week stretch. That would be great for us to see as fantasy managers, and I think viable. This is a really fun one to watch, and that's a game that I think will be a very good one to watch. One game that I completely whiffed on. Last week, I made this bold prediction that the Carolina Panthers were going to beat the Dallas Cowboys by double digits. Chuba Hubbard was going to have a 30-point PPR week and challenge for RB1 overall in the week. Completely whiffed on this one. Bryce Young went back to being bad Bryce Young. 4 turnovers. He did have 2 touchdowns, so if you had to use him in Superflex, you weren't like completely buried. One was a rushing score, one was a passing score. But the one player that I think was extremely tilting for fantasy managers was Chuba Hubbard, because they had this game circled for multiple weeks. And this was sort of the theme of a lot of these running backs last week. Failed to deliver a big performance when it mattered the most. But what did you see from Chuba usage-wise? Is this a guy that you're still trusting as like a borderline RB1? Are we on a low-end RB2? Like, where are you at this week on Chuba?
Yeah, usage insane, 94% snap share, 78% route share. It means like he shouldn't be too game script sensitive. He kind of is, but that's just more like how often Carolina gets blown out. In games Carolina hasn't lost by multiple scores. He's averaging 19 fantasy points per game, 21 XFP per game. Those are both top 3 numbers. In all other games, he's more in the high-end RB3 range. So you look at the next 2 games, Panthers are 4.5 point underdogs. So like at least those spreads are kind of tight. To me, high-end RB2 is what I would say. The usage and volume is just so good. And hopefully we get more of the Bryce Young, previous to this game, like the last 3 or 4 weeks previous to this game, rather than the Bryce Young we got last week.
Yeah, and to Chuba Hubbard's like credit, he still did get 4 receptions. So that's something we've seen for back-to-back weeks. I think that's a nice thing we can lean on. And I think in that Arizona game, a few more receptions on top of his rushing attempts would go a long way. I'm with you. I'm just a little less excited about it. This is another quarterback situation to keep an eye on because Bryce Young had really built a good amount of goodwill over his last few weeks. But if we see another few clunkers like we saw against Dallas, this could be one where they really go and readdress that quarterback situation in Carolina. Um, let's talk about in the NFC South as well. We talked about Chuba Hubbard. Which running back would you rather use in Week 16 with the money on the line, Bucky Irving or Rashad White?
Oh, I'd go Bucky Irving.
Yeah.
He's just so much more efficient. It was like a 50-50 split last week, but don't forget he's been dealing with injury. And so hopefully that continues to climb as he gets closer to full health.
Yeah, I don't think we really even need to talk too much about that one. It's Bucky over Rashad White. But if I had to use Rashad White, I could talk myself into it as well. Quick dynasty segue. This has become sort of a hot topic, and I know there's a number of people at Fantasy Points who might have differing opinions about this. Where are you at on Malik Nabers versus Brian Thomas in Dynasty? This is a really interesting one because Brian Thomas has sort of joined Malik Nabers in probable wide receiver 1 finishers this season. They were teammates at LSU. Malik Nabers obviously was much more hyped coming into the season, but Brian Thomas has earned every bit of respect from the fantasy and dynasty community. Unbelievable run for Thomas. Was a week winner this past week. And Nabers also had a strong game. Where are you at on these two guys?
Yeah. So if you look at BTJ minus those 3 games where he was obviously hurt, averaging 17.4, the only rookie wide receiver since 2010 to rank above him, Ja'Marr Chase, Puka, OBJ. So that's some great company to be with. 2.63 yards per route run, only Puka Nakua's above that. And like this has always been one of the most predictive metrics for young wide receivers. So I feel really confident in his talent. I think he's still ascending, freak athlete who is, considered very raw coming out, seems to get better every week. So that's the stats for BTJ. The stats for Malik Nabers is he has the highest target share, the highest first read target share in fantasy points data history. That's any player, not just rookie. And he's doing it as a rookie. And to me, I gravitate more towards volume, I'd say. And this is kind of who he was in college. They were on the same team. Who was the alpha hog? It was Malik Nabers. There are games this season where Nabers has gotten 10 plus targets and he's, bitching on the sideline, demanding more targets. And like you love that attitude when you roster a player like that in fantasy. And he's right too. Like you look at EPA per target, he's one of the most efficient wide receivers in football. Everyone else in the Giants ranks, bottom 10. So yeah, get this guy even more targets. I feel much more confident in Nabers, a little bit more quarterback uncertainty there. Maybe not if they lock up the 101, draft Shador or something like that. But I either way, you're talking about a player who should be top 10 in dynasty rankings overall.
Yeah, I think both of these guys are locked in as like top 8 receivers in dynasty. Brian Thomas year 2 will be one that people are head over heels to draft. I think we go back to look at a guy like peak Josh Gordon. That's for me what we could end up seeing if the Brian Thomas year 2 season goes in the ceiling outcome. But when it comes down to it, I still will defer to Malik Nabers. When we are trying to chase down what a wide receiver 1 overall is, 3 out of the last 4 seasons, this year it's going to be Chase, but 3 out of the last 4 seasons, it was the player that led the league in targets and led the league in catches. And at the end of the day, what Malik Nabers has been able to do this season, he has 90 receptions in only 12 games played. The only rookie we ever saw be this efficient in terms of games played and catches is Odell Beckham in 2014. Malik Nabers, when it's all said and done, will have the most receptions ever by a rookie wide receiver. And I think this is the kind of guy that if they get their together in New York, and they have a Sam Darnold or a Shadur Sanders behind center, I think this could end up being Malik Nabers with an obscene amount of targets, an obscene amount of catches in year 2. So I'm still going to defer to Nabers, but I think they're both going to be extremely exciting players to draft this coming year. And if you have either one of them in Dynasty, you're feeling pretty good right now about your future wealth and earnings. Let's keep this going. You had a little Dynasty segue. Another player who's gained exceptional amount of Dynasty value this year, after losing some after his rookie year, was Jackson Smith-Njigba. This past week, JSN had a 50% first read target share. What is your thoughts on JSN this week? Looks like Geno Smith is going to play. There were some fears that it might be Sam Howell this week, but I think that everything sort of worked out. It's going to be Geno behind center. Your thoughts and expectations for JSN?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. Remember, we were kind of waffling, or I was waffling back. I'm like, I'm scared to believe again, but since Seattle's bye, 5 games, ranks 6th in fantasy points per game, 6th in receiving yards per game. He just had a 50% first read target share. Not only was that like easily a career high for him, but it was the highest by any Seahawks wide receiver since 2022. Seeing better volume, more volume than DK Metcalf. I think you're looking at JSN as a wide receiver 2 this week, and Metcalf is only a high-end wide receiver 3.
Scott's Keenan Allen comparison is officially back. We're excited about JSN. And JSN also chasing a fun outcome here. JSN, I love looking for guys who can set records. It's sort of an extra motivator, and teams care about this more than you think. JSN right now has 83 receptions. The record in Seattle for most receptions in a season is Tyler Lockett, just from a few seasons back. I believe that was 2022. JSN has a chance to set a new record as a 22-year-old. This is another player I think when we look back at the season as a whole, people are going to get more and more excited about drafting JSN, maybe in the 2nd round, early 3rd round in 2025. So Mason Rudolph back behind center makes me want to put Calvin Ridley in my fantasy lineups. Should fantasy managers be using Ridley in money-making week 16 with Mason Rudolph behind center, Scott?
I'm kind of excited about Ridley. In 9.5 quarters with Rudolph since DeAndre Hopkins was traded, Ridley averages about 11 targets, 17.2 fantasy points per 4 full quarters. And Rudolph has been a serious upgrade. You look at him in his starts this year, he's averaging 39.1 pass attempts per game, 265.7 passing yards per start. Both of those numbers would represent 50% plus improvements on what Will Levis has done. So I'm kind of excited about this. I mean, we'll still have to wait and see. This is just not a good offense, but it should be a clear upgrade for Calvin Ridley, who leads all players in uncatchable air yards this season.
Yeah, if only my league rewarded money for uncatchable air yards, the Calvin Ridley shares really would have paid off. Ridley's an interesting one because he did have those 2 big spike weeks, so you have that in your memory. But he's also been a guy where they've been sort of few and far between. But Indianapolis, I can kind of talk myself into it, and I'll say this, Scott: if we see enough there, he'll be one where you're much more excited about starting him in week 17 against Jacksonville. That might be one who might be like a weird draft pick who helps shift people in best ball championships and potentially even redraft ones. Your thoughts on the backfield in Tennessee? We saw a big Tyjae Spears game. Is this something where you could see it happening again? It was really a weird one. Tyjae Spears one that for weeks we sort of lost a lot of luster, and then all of a sudden he has a week like he did this past week.
Oh, I don't want to talk about the Titans backfield. This has been, I'm sure, driving Ryan crazy because he writes up most of the running backs every week, and it's like, oh, Pollard's the bell cow. Oh no, now it's a committee. Now they're just rotating drives. But last week it looked like Pollard was the early down workhorse, and Spears was the clear pass catching back, which is he's good at that, but. Maybe that's the more valuable role with Tennessee likely to trail their next 2 games, and Rudolph targeting running backs at a higher rate. But yeah, I'm just not really excited about either of these guys. It's kind of like a gross committee and not much upside on this bad offense.
Part of Ryan will be very pleased, though, anytime the 23-year-old outproduces the 27-year-old, because Ryan is a known ageist.
That's right.
But other than that, yeah, stay away from this one. It's a really, really gross question as well. Let's get back to talking about some good teams and some good players. What about, let's talk about a good player, but not necessarily a good situation. Desmond Ridder's impact on Brock Bowers. We're suffering a little bit here, Scott. Do we get a lifeline this week against Jacksonville?
Yeah. Ridder has been horrible for Brock Bowers owners. Ridder has targeted Bowers on only 15.6% of his throws. He was at 25% or more with both Gardner Minshew or Aiden O'Connell. Luckily, Antonio Pierce says he believes O'Connell's trending towards playing this week. So you're back to Bowers as a top 3 tight end, if that's the case.
Yeah, I had this conversation with somebody else earlier this week about I never thought I'd be this excited about a potential return of Aiden O'Connell. That's just how bad Ridder was. That, like, some of the plays in that Atlanta game were just inexplicably bad, and the Vegas still finds a way to lose the game. This is an interesting one. Your thoughts on Michael Penix taking over in Atlanta? Not on the show sheet, but does this do anything to sort of change your outlooks for the usage for the Atlanta receivers, potentially the usage for Bijan Robinson, or is it something where the whole offense just potentially gets better because the threat of a Kirk Cousins interception, maybe drives are more sustained? Sort of, where are you at on this one, Scott?
Yeah, I'm excited about it because you look at, Penix coming out. One of the knocks on him was he had these 3 elite wide receivers in Rome Odunze, Jalen Polk, Jalen McMillan, but it's like McMillan hasn't played well. Jalen Polk has been horrible. Rome Odunze struggled, although I think most of that's on Caleb Williams. And so like he's sort of like a stock riser just based on that, right? I think we talked about it on this show. I called him like the reverse Mettenberger, right? But I think this could theoretically benefit everyone. I think I could see the team leaning, more run heavy because it's like a rookie making his first start. But like that's exactly what we saw last week. The team does not trust Cousins at all. They threw only 17 times to 34 backfield rushing attempts on Monday night. I think Mooney could benefit because Penix, they were saying, like one of his greatest strengths was his deep ball, where like he threw this elite deep ball that like might be the best since Russell Wilson, or he could just lock on to Drake London in a way that Cousins really didn't for much of the year, because we see rookie quarterbacks do that constantly, just kind of lock into the trusted number one. And just I feel like efficiency has to improve because just how bad it was with Cousins. So I'm excited about this. Falcons get the Giants, who Lamar just badly beat up on. So I think they could kind of do whatever they want. I think if they want to kind of highlight, showcase Penix, I think they could do that. I think more likely Bijan just goes nuclear, and Algier maybe also has 80 rushing yards, but we'll see.
Yeah, it's for Michael Penix, the schedule actually works out fairly well because you get Giants this week, and then week 18 we don't care about for fantasy. And if you're in a league that still is playing in week 18, you might want to change that up. But he has 2 games where he could shine, both at home. This could be one where Penix gains a little bit of momentum. And I'll say the what I think is going to happen is you're going to see a rebound from Kyle Pitts. And not saying put him in your lineup, but I think he's going to get people to overdraft him for like the 10th season in a row because of the Michael Penix factor. Let's talk a little bit about this Miami situation, because Jalen Waddle not practicing today. It looks like Waddle is going to miss out. We could have a very consolidated target tree with Devon Achane, Tyreek Hill, Jonnu Smith heading into this Week 16 matchup against San Francisco. This is a weird one, because this is a game where before the season, we would have been extremely excited about this one. Both of these teams, big disappointments. Your thoughts about Miami in this matchup in a consolidated target tree?
I'm excited about Jonnu. I went heavy on him in DFS last week because he had those 3 massive games and then he struggled the week previous. And I was kind of just saying that was because the Jets stupidly, stubbornly played a ton of single high, which you just never do against Miami. And most teams don't do that because they know. And so last week it was right back to, sort of the number 1 role on the offense, had a team high 11 targets, 4 more than anyone else, a bunch of design targets, scored 19.8 fantasy points. And it honestly should have been an even bigger day. He just narrowly missed two touchdowns and some throws inside the 10-yard line. And yeah, you look at what he's done over his last 5 games, 8.8 targets, 79 yards, 16 XFP, 22 fantasy points per game. Those are all wide receiver 1 numbers and best on the team. So I'm excited about him. He's a great DFS value again this week. Unique upside, unique volume for a position that's otherwise pretty frustrating and volatile.
It's simply awesome when you look at the tight end scoring leaders and you see Jonnu Smith ahead of Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews. This is another player where when we talk about like lessons learned, this was the year of the free agent, and guys, when teams go and target these players in free agency, I think Jonnu Smith will be one where we have to be more open-minded to a role change and a guy potentially thriving in a new situation. Jonnu Smith's just been awesome. I'm with you. I think this is a guy who could really impact the next 2 weeks. You've seen him have so many games, Scott, where he's giving you like very high-end production now over the last 8 weeks or so. I'm very excited about this one. And anyone scoring at home, our guy Devon Achane is leading all running backs in receptions. We told you this weeks ago. Achane's at the top. And now you have Alvin Kamara potentially dealing with an injury. If Kamara misses out, your expectations for Kendre Miller?
Yeah, I'm pretty excited. It seems like Darren Rizzi really likes him. The commentary on him seems like they have full faith in him. Jamal Williams is still there. Jordan Mims is still there, but neither are guys that, I don't know, I'm excited about. I don't think they're excited about, and not really playing for anything else. Might as well get a good look at this guy you've had on your team for a while who just hasn't ever been healthy. It's also a horrible offense. New Orleans is implied for just 14.3 points against the Packers, according to Vegas. So not a ton of upside, but a desperation flex play.
Yeah, I think
I'd say that.
I think that's a good way of putting it. I would say desperation flex play with some juice, because the guy's running efficiently, and they nearly made a comeback against Washington, and Miller played very well, like right down the stretch. So this is one where why not let Kendre Miller have 25 touches this week? And I think that could totally happen. Let's talk about another player who's a deep sleeper for this week. We saw Evan Engram go to the IR, and Brenton Strange this past week led all tight ends with 12 targets and 11 catches. This was a 2nd-round draft pick. This is not like some guy who was just obscure. Your thoughts on Brenton Strange to close out the fantasy football playoffs? I'm pretty bullish on this one, Scott.
Yeah, me too. So we know how crucial the tight end position is for the Doug Peterson offense. And it's also Mac Jones, who loves tight ends. He's targeted tight ends at a top 6 rate among all current starters in the NFL. And yeah, 12 first read targets last week. That was the 2nd most by any tight end in any game this year. Offense seems like it's really just BTJ and Engram. And yeah, I think he's a tight end 1 this week.
Okay, I'll give you a live, our very first ever School of Scott start sit decision live on the air. Big money FFPC Dynasty League that I've shipped back-to-back seasons. This is a competitive triflex format. So it's super flex, wide receiver heavy, but it's still tight end premium. Mark Andrews, Brenton Strange, and I have one other tight end roster, Dalton Schultz. It's been a struggle at the tight end spot this year. Which way are you going there? Mark Andrews, the blue blood, or Brenton Strange off his 12 target, 11 catch game? Tight end premium.
Tight end premium, I think you got to go Strange. I think in a PPR, it's a lot closer just because touchdown upside. Charlie Kolar out for the Ravens, but I don't know. Maybe Strange in both, honestly.
Yeah,
Probably Strange in both.
that's where I'm leaning. I'm going with Strange. So strange things happen in the fantasy football playoffs, and it's Brenton Strange over Mark Andrews. The last team I want to ask you about before we get going, Chicago Bears. Your trust level. We talked a little bit about that. The Lions. We talked a lot about the Lions. Their opponent this week is the Chicago Bears, and this Bears team took them down to the wire on Thanksgiving. This is one where Detroit got off to a really red hot start. Jahmyr Gibbs had that fumble right before halftime. Chicago played extremely well. And then we had the craziest non-timeout call ever to sort of end the game. But Chicago, which wide receivers are you trusting the most? Like, and quantify it for everyone. DJ Moore is a wide receiver what? Keenan Allen is a wide receiver what this week for fantasy managers looking for start-sit decisions?
Yeah, I'd say Moore is a high-end wide receiver 2, Allen a mid-range wide receiver 2, Odunze a high-end wide receiver 4. Caleb Williams is a little tough to trust. He's by a number of advanced metrics having one of the worst rookie quarterback seasons in a half decade. Like arguably worse than like a Zach Wilson, maybe even a Bryce Young, but the volume's there. He's very schedule sensitive. So he's really feasted in these bottom 5 matchups, which maybe Detroit is now given their injury situation. And since Thomas Brown took over, Keenan Allen, DJ Moore, both top 12 wide receivers in fantasy. Maybe what's more is on Thanksgiving when these teams played, they both scored at least 23.5 fantasy points, and Moore had insane volume, 16 targets, 34.1 XFP. That was one of the 6 highest XFP games this entire season by anyone. So, yeah, I'm excited about them this week for sure.
Yeah, and if you like, I'm with you. I think this is a game where no matter what, DJ Moore is in your lineup. But I'm also pretty excited about Keenan Allen in this one. I think this is one where, like we talked about, it's going to be an over environment. It's a soft defense. As long as Caleb Williams doesn't go absolutely nuts, then this is one where it should be beneficial for us fantasy football managers on both sides of the ball. Scott, we're gonna be missing for like a couple weeks now with the holidays coming up. Let's get a holiday movie recommendation from Scott Barrett before we close this thing out.
Wait, what is your favorite Christmas movie of all time?
I got a couple. So for the adults out there, obviously it's Christmas Vacation. And then for the kids, Home Alone is the unquestioned GOAT. That one is fantastic. Home Alone 1, Home Alone 2. And then my sons, they love Red 1. Red 1 just dropped on Amazon Prime. A lot of haters from the adult community on Red 1, but it's The Rock Christmas. My sons looked me dead in the eye, and they said that's just as good as Home Alone, if not better. I was shocked, Scott.
Yeah, so I'm gonna have to disagree with. Well, I mean, I think Home Alone is great, but when you're talking about Christmas time, you're talking about It's a Wonderful Life, which isn't just far and away the best Christmas movie ever. It is maybe the best movie ever. Like if you want to look at my rankings, it's going to be a bunch of film snob movies like Lawrence of Arabia, Godfather 1 and 2, a bunch of Scorsese. But like maybe honestly, number 1 on the list is It's a Wonderful Life. Miracle on 34th Street is up there. Some really good old Christmas movies. Yeah, It's a Wonderful Life, goated, watch it. Might be my favorite movie ever.
Let us know in the comments, It's a Wonderful Life or Home Alone. Where are you at on this one? A big thank you to our audience who helped School of Scott grow. It's been a pleasure for me to have a chance to join this show this year, and hopefully we put out some content that's helped you win. Now it's time for us to take advantage of all of the moves we made this year and go win a fantasy football championship. Good luck and happy holidays.